Hey, welcome to our talk tonight. My name is Yng-Ru Chen, and I am the founder and CEO of Praise Shadows Art Gallery in Brookline, Massachusetts, right outside of Boston. And tonight we are thrilled and honored to have two speakers who will be speaking to the recent exhibition or the current exhibition at the gallery, and also to some very critical issues happening in our country at this time. So I want just to briefly introduce the gallery for those of you who are new to our program. We opened in December of 2020, and we are located in Brookline, and Iwon Wu's show is called Internal Navigation. It is on view until October 10th, and I hope that all of you will have a chance to come see it. We are thrilled with the response so far. I'm going to just share my screen real quick so you can see a couple of shots from the installation. It's a multimedia work spanning drawing, maps, installation, books, and if you have not had a chance to come see it, please do so. We're open from Wednesday through Sunday, and you can check out our website, www.praiseshadows.com. I am going to try and stop. Oops, sorry. Stop sharing my screen. And now we will introduce our two speakers. So first up is Iwon Wu, who is our esteemed artist. And I'm just going to read this from her bio real quick. Yu-Wen is an interdisciplinary artist living and working in Boston, born in Taipei, Taiwan, and relocating to the United States at an early age. Her experiences as an immigrant have shaped her work. At the crossroads of art, science, politics, and social issues, her wide range of projects include large-scale drawings, site-specific video installations, community-engaged practices, and public arts. She is the recipient of the inaugural Trilla Smith Brackett Award by the Davis Art Museum, the Mass Cultural Council Award in Sculpture, Installation, and New Genre, and she is also the recipient of an award from the Union of Concerned Scientists. Her commissioned works include Harvard Business School and the Greenway Conservancy. Some of you may have seen Lantern Stories was up last year. That was just completed, and in fact, she has been commissioned to create a similar work for San Francisco, which will open in 2022. So welcome, Yu-Wen. The next person I'll introduce is Professor Anlin Cheng. I almost said your Chinese last name, Cheng. Professor of English at Princeton University and an affiliate of the programs in American Studies and in Gender and Sexuality Studies. She is the author of The Melancholy of Race, Assimilation, Psychoanalysis, and Hidden Grief, Second Skin, Josephine Baker, and the Modern Surface, and most recently, Ornamentalism. She specializes in modernism, comparative race studies, and the uneasy confrontation between politics and aesthetics in the diverse fields of psychoanalysis, law, architecture, film, fashion, and other visual cultures. I most recently read her writing in the New York Times and the Atlantic, and she has been published many times in acclaimed journals and publications. So thank you and welcome, Professor Cheng. So I am going to share my screen one more time because we have a special treat, and it is this lovely image of the three of us. Because the three of us were all immigrants from Taipei, Taiwan to the United States. And we settled here in different places and in different times, but here we all are now connected on this screen. And I wanted to, I asked Yu-Wen and Anne to share their images with me because I just thought this was so poignant. We all have these pictures of, that period in between our immigration. And that's me on the right, in the center is Yu-Wen, and on the left is Anne. So I'm going to start with a little icebreaker question, and I'll answer it myself first, but the question is to the panelists and to myself, what our first memories of arriving to America is or are. And I came to Boston when I was 5 years old. And my first memory, because I came in the late fall, it was cold, and just looking out the window of the car and seeing the vastness of the city, even though now in retrospect, Boston is, a tiny little city compared to so many other places in the United States. But for where I was coming from, it just felt so big. And I actually remember Mark de Suvero, like public art sculpture outside. And I just kept being so excited for snow because it's so hot in Taiwan. It doesn't snow, but the only snow I ever saw were snowballs coming down in cartoons. So I thought snow came down in balls. I thought it rained big balls, or snowed big balls. So my first memory is this very specific image from my mind. Yu-Wen, what is your first memory of arriving to America, and how old were you?
So my first recollection of landing in the United States, and I was about 6 at that time, we landed in New York City, and that everything just seemed really large. The airport, the buildings, the people, So when I left Taiwan, I truly believed that the streets would be paved in gold. And I was too young to understand that that was a metaphor. So in my imagination, I really thought I would step out and see these amazing streets. Well, I was kind of disappointed because we landed in New York City and the streets were concrete and asphalt. So that didn't work. But what made the trip really magical was that my dad picked us up in a wonderful Chevy, this cream and that wonderful green and lots of chrome. And these rocket ship lights, the back tail lights, it was just wonderful. And so I remember swimming in the back seat and just being in awe of the tall buildings and just quite, feeling strange, but also inspired at the same time.
Yeah, it's so funny how we have all these symbols of what we thought America would be. Gold or these snowballs. And what about you? What was your first memory and how old were you when you immigrated?
I was 11, and it's actually also interesting how similar in some ways our first experiences were. So we were going to meet my father, who was already in the States for a year.
It was mine, by the way. All of our fathers came here first. That's
right. And so my father was here for a year. He was at the Medical College of Georgia in Augusta. But my mom, my brother, and I first landed in LAX, and then made our way, across the country. But my first view was actually being incredibly impressed by the convoluted, multi-layer LA freeway system, which has seemed to me, I just remember feeling at once a sense of tremendous freedom, but also being tremendously lost at the same time. So it's a weird, ambivalent feeling. And then when we found in Augusta, my father was there with this is a similar experience with his turquoise Chevrolet Impala, which I thought was the largest car that I've ever seen. And we rattled around in the back seat, as we drove through what seems like endless miles with no house inside and just land. So that's a vast space of the territory that is America was what really impressed me first.
It's so funny how we all have these memories of the cars and how vast it was. I think this is a really good segue to the rest of the talk, actually, but actually tell us here first, out of these 4 children, which one is you?
So I'm the second one from the right.
Mm-hmm.
Right next to me is my brother, David. And then the 2 children flanking us are my American cousins who came to visit from the United States. This is Taipei, the picture you have. Mm-hmm. They came to visit. This is like a year or 2 before we left for the US. And those are our cousins, and they are, you can probably tell, they're biracial, did not speak a word of Taiwanese or Mandarin. And we didn't speak any English at the time. But I remember we had just had the funnest time. I have no idea how we communicated, but a great time.
That's great. Well, thank you. All right, so I'm gonna continue the conversation right now to present a question to Anne. So your first book was called The Melancholy of Race, Psychoanalysis, Assimilation, and Hidden Grief. And by the way, it's an intense and fierce book, as is all of Anne's writing. I highly recommend everyone check it out. So in this book, you talk about the difference between grief and grievance, which I think is really interesting. Can you speak to that, please?
Yeah, so I think that we as an American society, that we're such a litigious society, and that we're really used to the mode of grievance, and especially when it comes to issues of racial injury and wounds. But I think that grievance has done a lot of important political work. So, but at the same time, I feel like oftentimes grievance come to take the place of what I think of as the work of mourning, right? The work of really grieving over some of the more ineffable aspects of immigration, of assimilation, of racial injury. And so for me, grievance is a language of quantification. This is how much you have hurt me. But grief, on the other hand, I think is a language that cannot be quantified. It's more about working through and experiencing those afterlife of loss and alienation that lingers and stays with us, and that compensation cannot quite address, right? So I think the best way to think about grief versus grievance is one of my favorite quotes from Robert Frost, who said that, quote, grievance is a form of impatience. Grief is a form of patience. And so I think about how even though, and so I think also about the ways in which, so my distinction between grief and grievance is also in the end an argument for art and literature, because I think it is actually in the realm of art. So people often think, art, what does that have to do with politics, or even if you try to address political things, it can't really do very much. It's not the same as material advocacy work, for example. But I try to make the argument that it's actually that art and literature, the realm of the aesthetic, can actually offer us a language for thinking about grief in a way that legal discourse of grievance may not cover. And so actually thinking about that, I was really interested in asking Yu-Wen to talk about her piece, Walking to Taipei, which is, to me, very much a project about patience, project about continual recovery, even as it tracks certain kind of disconnects and losses. And so to me, it's actually to me a very interesting meditation or practice of patience and grief along the lines that I'm thinking of.
Thank you for prefacing all of that. I have this image up, since you mentioned Walking to Taipei, which is this 20-foot long scroll in the exhibition. Yuen, do you want to talk for a minute about this work and the grief that led you to make this work?
Sure.
And patience, actually.
And patience. This piece took 10 years, so it does require a lot of patience. This work called Walking to Taipei came about, I think, in a moment like a waking dream. It was probably born from longing and grief for not being with my grandmother, who at that time was very ill. And I imagined walking there from Boston. So I typed in the directions in Google Maps just for the heck of it. And to my astonishment, it actually gave me directions, walking directions. And what resulted was a 94-page, 2,052 instructional steps at 11,000 plus miles. And it would take 155 days and 5 hours without sleeping. So the directions even cautioned that the route may be missing sidewalks or pedestrian paths. Fortunately, I was able to save this in a PDF because I have not been able to replicate it again. This scroll is constructed and unravels in two directions. It speaks to me of not being able to put down roots in either land as a first generation. It's trying to locate a sense of time. but perhaps too, in a hopeful way, it's about the fluidity of new Asian American generations that are more global citizens and can traverse, fluidly between two or more multiple worlds. So hence you can open it one way, unravel it one way in these vignettes, and then you can unravel it the other way, going back to Boston.
So Yu-Wen, can you talk to us about, so one of the things, so I have to tell you that I am teaching a class now called American Studies 101, which is a gay studies at Princeton. And one of our first assignments, and it's a large lecture class, about 175 people. And one of our first assignment was that they had to write about a map. And we gave them, this is just me and my team teachers, because it's a team talk class, we gave the students 3 maps, including this work. Assigned it to the students, and they're to write about. They have to pick, 2 of the 3 and write about the maps. And one of the things we tell the students is that maps are not, they're not facts. They are not given facts. They're actually, it's a graphic that produces meaning. Maps produce meanings. And they're supposed to look at the maps and then sort of try to trace out for the reader the ways in which meanings are produced in any particular given map. And so this map to me seemed to me, and the reason I assigned it, because I thought it was such a rich meditation on the nature of trying to find meaning in directions that are at once incredibly specific, the Pacific Ocean, and yet at the same time, both simultaneously very specific and also kind of impossible. Right. I mean, you have whatever 2,000 steps, but you cannot really do it. And so that ambivalence about a kind of specificity of semi-scientific information and knowledge versus the much more ineffable, impossible navigations of internal longing and loss. That tension is so exquisite in the piece. And I was wondering if you could say more about how you thought about the way you laid out the directions. I mean, I love what you said about the two-dimensional of the two-directional of the scroll, but I think the actual geography of these lines are also really fascinating. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how, what's your strategy for thinking about that?
So the Chinese scroll is really a timeline. It's a storytelling. You can open it in different parts. It tells you, and it has these, almost short stories as you open and close and open and close in different sections. And so I was thinking very much about how to keep that tradition without, exact replication, and using the Google steps. And so what I did was I did it in different segments. So one vignette would be about 4 feet or so. It would actually, you would need to physically move with the scroll in order to read direction number 1 to 25, and then you would have to come back. And so there's a physical movement to this. There's a you are the body with the map. And other times the vignette is very small, so you would just be, your eyes could move back and forth. And so this kind of transitional feeling of how your body interacts with the space was really important in deciding how to execute this particular piece.
And what is the, I don't know if people can see from the audience, but what is the choice behind, is there a difference between the directions in the beige versus the lighter color ones?
Now, when Google printed out this, had it in the PDF, it was 2 colors. It was white and gray and white and gray. And so I took advantage of this, thinking about, I guess you can't see the gray there very well, but it was in different lines. alternate lines. And so I really thought about how to, and this is a aesthetic decision, about how to get that movement going visually and how to transport you through a landscape with just two colors.
Yeah. So the design aesthetic, I thought, I mean, there's so much going on in that work. You have the reference to Chinese classical painting and the scroll and the movement, but then you're also taking this very contemporary experience of Google mapping and, recontextualizing all of it, which I think is just the biggest and most pleasant surprise to people, because we don't often see those two put together in this way. And I think everyone should come see it. Really, it's a work that has to be experienced in person if possible. So again, please come by October 10th. I do want to move on to another body of work that we, the three of us, have really discussed in length and felt was important to talk about in this conversation, because it speaks to the immigrant experience and to the notion of the American dream. And I'll let you lead from here, but this body of work is called The Accumulation of Dreams. And I'll pull up those images while you start talking.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, my eyes were drawn to this piece almost right away, and it's partially because I've been lecturing about the Transcontinental Railway and the Chinese laborers, right, that helped build the railway, which of course brought in questions of Chinese laborers who came during the gold rush, and that's the sort of like association I have with the Accumulation of Dreams, but. I love this piece because, again, there's so much movement in this. If we think about the history of the gold rush and therefore the history of Asian presence and Chinese presence in America, a presence that was both fundamental to the building of really the infrastructure of the United States post-Civil War. The infrastructure for modern American economy as we know it today, right? The world. Also the erasure of those bodies from history. So the goal for reminds me of that. The accumulation reminds me of the years and decades of Asian presence in America, unacknowledged often, but nonetheless a steady, slow increase. I'm thinking too about the ways in which these waves made me think about it's evocative of landscape and nature and movement, but they're gold foil, right, Yü-Wen? So there's also this sort of sense of a decorative the promise of gold, which is a promise, that Yü-Wen talks about when she thought the roads in America would be paved with gold. But this promise of gold and what this promise has meant to Chinese immigrants to America, right? A promise that is both, sometimes fulfilled, but mostly not and I'm talking about from 19th century on today, and leading us today to think about this question of the American dream. What is it? Who get to have it? What labor is involved in getting it, including the labor of assimilation. So I don't know if this is what you were thinking of in your mind when you're doing this piece, Yü-Wen, but it's just so evocative for me in all those ways.
Everything you said went into the thinking of how to make this work. And in the making of it, I have to say that every single leaf, every single drop of whether it's a tear or it's a leaf, it's a memory, it's a dream. Every single one individual, it's a dream. And so it's a collection of all these histories that really mattered to me as I constructed this work. And in this also is the leaf in this is also based on a lot of the work I've been doing with tea. And, tea as a metaphor for the Asian culture and one thing, but, the whole history of porcelain and other trans-Pacific commodities in the centuries between China and the US. And, you know, there's a whole history there of trade, you know, whether it's, you know, tea was worth more than gold at one point. And I think you could probably speak better to this.
They used to, well, I mean, what I like about this, one thing I think is very powerful about this piece is that we could think of these leaves as individuals, or individual dreams, you know, that immigrants have. But these individuals, persons, are also sort of conflated or confused for tea leaves. And that sort of confusion between persons and things is actually, you know, a very old historic phenomenon around the Western imaginary about the Chinese. They were, you know, so you just mentioned the history of commodities, porcelain, sugar, all these sort of trans-Pacific and transatlantic commodities that were sort of precious goods from China, which America very much wanted, even before America was America, even during colonial times. But all these commodities actually were also often confused with persons. So with porcelain, for example, you know, the way in the 19th century, they used to talk about Chinese porcelain, that it is cool, that it can withstand a lot of heat, that it is, you know, a proper, that it has it's particularly, what's the word, like accommodating to manipulation, you know, and so forth, like and things like that. But oftentimes all those vocabulary about things get sort of like translated and ascribed to people. And so, you know, so when Western, when you're mostly European American thought about cool, so-called coolies, for example, they talk about them almost like they're talking about porcelain, or that is to say they can endure tremendous heat and pain, and therefore, you know, and therefore they're disposable labor, right? And so, and of course, you know, tea and teacups and porcelain are also very often associated with Asiatic femininity. You know, even today, when we talk about the porcelain beauty, right, of Asian women, you know, there's you know, you could see Nancy Kwan at 2 o'clock in the morning, Nancy Kwan at 2 o'clock in the morning, hawking pearl cream, the ancient secret to you know, Chinese beauty or something like that. But you know, but this, you know, and all the discourse around K-beauty today about how you could get porcelain skin. So there's actually this sort of literal confusion between persons, Asiatic persons, and Asian commodities. You know, it's a confusion between persons and things that I think has lasted to this day.
Wow. And you're so brilliant. I mean, this is why everyone should read the book. I mean, and ornamentalism is such a game changer for how we think about aesthetics of the Asian woman. I just thank you for your scholarship. It's absolutely incredible. And there's so much to say about it, you know, as someone who studied art history, but also Asian studies in a time when I don't think that people like you were teaching it in when I was growing up. I wish I had that, because there were so many structures that were embedded in these colonial imperialistic notions of what Asian art and beauty should be. But you know, there's more to Yü-Wen's work that is that speaks to the tea trade, but also to the identities of Asian Americans and of Asian people. And one of those works is called Not All Alike, which is a series. And in our exhibition, Yü-Wen's piece is the largest that she's done of this series. And I'll pull that up in a minute, but I know that the two of you wanted to talk about this work as well.
Yeah, it's such an amazing piece too in relation to this question of persons and things. If we could pull up the image of Not All Alike.
Coming up.
Even the title of the piece already refers to a particular, a racist trope around Asians, which is that they all look alike, right? And that actually, I was just thinking the other day, I was telling some student about this, that actually the fact that we have photographs in our passport, that our modern passport looked the way it did, that the way it does, has everything to do with anti-Asian immigration sentiments. Right? So it was in the 19th century, precisely because of this anxiety about how you just cannot tell Asian apart, that they started asking for photos to be stapled on papers, on immigration papers. And that's actually the beginning of why our passport, look the way it does with the pictures. There was not so recent, maybe 6 years ago, but there was a wonderful show about this at the National Gallery in DC. I think the show was called Faces at the Gates, and it was all about these early immigration photos and these early passports. But anyway, so this piece I think is particularly, first of all, I think it's aesthetically really beautiful. But if you look at it and think about it, it also is, I think, a rather profound meditation on this question of how, Asians look alike. And in fact, we could see from the tea leaves. Tea leaves are kind of like snowflakes, right? You may think they all look alike, but they don't. They actually, all, tremendously different. And what I particularly love about the tea leaves here is that one, it's coated in gold. So again, it's referencing this history of not just gold, but of value, right? That surrounds Asiatic commodities and person, the ways in which they're valued, but also maybe devalued, right? So that the gold here is just a foil rather than solid gold. I also think I love the way that these leaves are not only each so individuated, but that they all also a little bit anthropomorphic. They look a little bit like persons, right? Looking like person, they also remind us that history of the ways in which tea and its various accoutrements has been appropriated by European American cultures and then gets sort of confused for characteristic of Asiatic persons.
Yeah, when I began the series, it really was a response to more of a personal experience of invisibility and conflation of identity. And, I know that so many Asian Americans, and particularly Asian American females, experience this. And it even goes, further into conflation of racism and sexism, but that's a whole nother conversation. So, but yeah, this tea comes from my mom, my aunts from Taiwan. So they are particularly even Taiwan tea. So the choice of materials is really important here, as well as everything that Anne said. Yeah.
Yu-Wen, do you remember the moment that you decided to dip tea in gold?
Yeah, it was kind of a mistake. I was drinking tea and there was a pot of gilded gold there, and well, it was like a natural, chemistry here. Let's just give it a try. Mm-hmm. And then everything clicked that I was working on in terms of thoughts about what gold meant, what tea meant, how it could come together as a piece in discussion to, all the things that Anne just mentioned.
So Yuen, I was going to ask you something. A lot of you, what I think is interesting about a lot of your work is that it is both, I think your work is both very material based and conceptual at the same time. Mm-hmm. And so I was sort of curious about your method of working. So do you start with, and maybe it's different with different pieces, but do you start with a conceptual idea and then you figure out how to materialize it, so to speak? Or are you inspired more often by, like what you said, like with the tea, like that moment of encountering materiality and the foil and so forth? I mean, you probably have different answers to different projects, but I'm just sort of curious if you have a general way of working that you could share with us.
The process differs, of course, with each of the works, but I do a lot of reading, a lot of research, a lot of drawing, a lot of sketching, a lot of thinking about how can I represent this particular idea that I'm concerned with. And so the issues are driving, so sometimes what I want to say and how I want to say it. And then the materials are everywhere in my studio. It's quite a mess, and I can just pull from this and this and just try different things with it. And that's when it becomes more intuition rather than, a really formed conceptual idea. It becomes the making. And I love that part, the intuitive part.
We look at the red thread piece.
Which, the book?
Yeah.
Let me
So,
see.
Yng-Ru, can you talk a little bit about this piece?
Intentions. So, my grandmother was a very important figure in my early life. My father had already been in the United States. My mother was a teacher, and she taught in a different prefecture. So she was gone, many, many hours per day. I barely saw her sometimes until she came home late at night. And so my grandmother really was his mentor. I thought she was like Wonder Woman. She was just an amazing person in a culture that really denigrated so much of what females could stand, what could do. And so she did sewing for a living, because during that time of Japanese occupation, she had to, my grandparents had 6 children, and my grandfather was also a school teacher. He had to teach Japanese, and my grandmother, did sewing on the side. And so one of the things that was really important, both in her sewing and in her metaphor of family, was this idea of the red thread. And the red thread really for her stood for bloodlines, stood for binding us together. So for instance, on the day that I was born and all the other babies that were born, she would tie the other babies in our family, she would tie a red thread around our wrist and say a prayer. So the red thread has been really important in my work. And in this particular piece, this is called Intentions. And this is based on her prayer beads. And so there are 108 orbs of gold, and they're also made from tea. And they're wrapped in the red thread.
It's interesting. I was thinking about, I don't know if the red thread is a kind of Taiwanese trope or lore, but I had told my children, they were little, there is an invisible but red, if you could see it, that goes from my heart to theirs, and that it is unbreakable. No matter, it could stretch really far, or you could, but you will never be broken. And so, so the red thread, at least between my children and me, has a very similar, meaning about family and connection. And I think this piece is, I love this piece because I like that to me, it's full of motion. It seems to be falling and it's pooling and it's doing its own version of accumulation. But it is also fragile. When you're standing far away, you may not be able to see the connecting threads, which you can see when you're close up. And so I think it's a sort of lovely meditation about family connections, inheritance, the strength of that inheritance, but also the fragility of it. Yeah, it's very beautiful.
Thank you.
I love, if you notice that this very last, this end piece in this mala bead is not coiled in red. And that was also intentional. Yu-Wen, do you want to talk about that really quickly before we move to the next?
I wanted to leave this last ball open-ended. I wanted to be a developing intention for the viewer. What would you want to do? What would you intend? It can change, tomorrow. It could change in a year. It could change in 5. It's something that I think about holding inside myself all the time, so.
Thank you. We have about 20 more minutes, and I want to make sure we have a little bit of time at the end for any questions. So if anybody has questions for either Anne or Yu-Wen, please put in the chat or in the Q&A, and we'll get to that. But first, we're going to talk a little bit about Yu-Wen's public art practice, and more specifically, this project, Lantern Stories. And Anne, I'll let you start with this end of the conversation. But for those of you who saw it, it was in Boston during the pandemic, right? It was right before the pandemic that it opened. It
was in the fall.
It was in the fall. It was such a blur, but it was absolutely beautiful. And I know Cynthia Yi, who was here earlier, but had to leave the talk, who was my sister's first grade teacher as well. But she, our #1 gallery fan too. I just adore Miss Yi. But I know that all of you are so involved in gathering the community for this project, and that is such a core part of your practice. But I'll let you to discuss this here.
Why don't you start by telling us a little bit about the project?
So,
it's beautiful.
In Lantern Stories, this was commissioned by the Greenway Conservancy. They commissioned a light-based artwork. And I was thinking about how light illuminates and how it reveals. And, it was just interesting to juxtapose this familiar, iconic object as a first experience. But then when you get closer and you look carefully at each one, each of them are embedded with issues in unexpected ways. So a lot of this, the content of the lanterns developed during the pandemic, the anti-Asian hate, violence, and the Black Lives Matter movement. And it seemed like the perfect project to reflect on the politics and the social climate of this time. So that was, the research and development was pretty much during the early phases, and then of spring and summer, and then it hung in last fall for a few months.
Are they paper? Are the lanterns made of paper?
No, they're made of a Tyvek-like material so that they can withstand the weather.
Yeah,
right. So Lantern Story just celebrates, the Boston Chinatown's vibrant community. It's, it really talks about its history, its culture, its resiliency. It was an opportunity to really relate the long and fraught history of the Chinese immigration to the United States.
I actually love that. I love this sort of, the combination of a traditional object, the lantern, with all these contemporary, with both history but also contemporary issues and contemporary moments. And it, this to tie this back to a little bit our previous conversation, when you were talking about the gold ball that wasn't wrapped yet, because there's a story waiting to be told. It just made me think about the element of hope in your work that I find also alongside the mourning, the sometimes the sense of melancholy over loss. There's also this element of hope, which I think we all have to cling to. Reminds me of the other piece with the blocks. And you told a story about your grandmother asking a question before coming to the States. Do Do you want to tell that story?
Oh, about the moon blocks.
Yeah.
I can find that image. Hold on. Okay, go ahead and talk. I'll look for the image.
So my grandmother is Taoist, and one of the practices is she used these moon blocks, which is a divination tool. And you know, on the last and the days right before we were leaving for the United States, she asked a very poignant question, which I think all immigrants ask, right? Are we going to be safe? And are we going to be happy? And so this is what she used. And what happens is you say the prayer in your hand, you shake it in the temple, you drop it. And depending on which way it lands, it's a yes, no, or maybe. So for me, it was kind of fun to go with her. I didn't really understand the deep significance of it, but I knew that it meant so much to her that I went with her to the temple on the last day.
Well, I think it's such a poignant question because you're right. It's what every immigrant's asks, and it's particularly poignant for me these days because just the other day, a very good friend of mine said this thing to me, where she said, because we're talking about what's going on with the anti-AAPI and hatred, and she said this thing which just made me so sad. She said, you know, all the places that we used to think were Asian friendly, New York, San Francisco, Seattle, Vancouver, are turning out to be dangerous places.
Mm-hmm.
And when she said that, it saddened me so much, not only because of the truth of what she just said, but also because it also reminded me of the ways in which, even in a time of nonviolence, that question, are we safe? Are we going to be safe? Is something that haunts every immigrant.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's such a, that notion of wondering, but also of hope. I think it's really important to remember that, especially these days with all the immigration crisis going on at the borders, you know, the ways in which we tend to forget that that history is producing history, both in terms of political unrest, but also history in terms of climate change. You know, it's producing more and more people who are forced to move elsewhere, right? Migrate,
Totally place. Yeah.
Yeah, but they're not recognized by state institutional nationalist structure, and they become what the historian May Nai brilliantly calls impossible subjects, right? These people are impossible subjects because they're put out of where they're displaced, but there's nowhere for them to go to. This dilemma, I think, you know, which is, I think, going to face the world, like a global problem, more and more across time. And it's important to remember that these so-called impossible subjects are people with hope.
Yeah, yes, for
People
sure.
who are looking for a better life for themselves, and children, and you know, and if we could remember that, and remember these are people, rather than you know, a statistic, an unwanted number. So yeah, so I just want to sort of underscore how moving I think your grandmother's question is, and the hope that's embodied and embedded in that.
Absolutely. Thank you. Well, we have about 10 more minutes. If anybody has a question or comment that they want to pose to our speakers, please do that. I can always ask questions, so I might do that here. But actually, I'm going to ask a question to Anne. You know, when I asked you to consider moderating this talk, what would you say was, you know, something that made you say yes to the work? I mean, besides some of the things that you've mentioned, but was there something that really stuck out for you? And I asked this question because, you know, I am an Asian American woman who works in the arts. I've seen many artists over my career. And I think that there's a fine line sometimes between working with materials that reference Asian culture and, you know, going to a place where you feel like you're going to be pigeonholed, right? But I think Yue-Wen does this so masterfully because she completely, she creates a whole new space for these types of materials and dialogue. That's where I came from when I reacted to her work on our first studio visit a few years ago, and I just was so blown away. I'm curious to hear from you what might have stuck out for you in learning about her work.
Well, when you first asked me, when I was first approached with this possibility, the first thing I did was ask to see the work, right? Because I want to make sure that it is work that I have engagement with, that can contribute, a conversation, contributing in conversation to that engagement. And I think that what I thought right away was the ways in which the pieces spoke to me. And it has to do with precisely that. I thought that there was, I think the thing about Yu-Wen's work that's very powerful and that you can kind of sense. I mean, this is the thing about art is that your instincts sort of respond prior to other things, but it's so thoughtful. Right? That's the thing about Yu-Wen's work is that it's so thoughtful. And I thought the way it negotiated references to recognizable tropes like tea, for example, but how she manages to both transform the property of that object while preserving a conversation with its history. That's just one example of the ways in which I thought the work was really thoughtful. And so I was very excited to be able to have this conversation, with the two of you about this work. But I do think that, yes, it is very difficult. I think that all artists of color have to confront a set of expectations that do not surround artists of non-color, right? Questions about representation, you're expected to represent, and usually you expect to represent in a positive way. And if you don't represent, somehow you're a traitor, right? Or if you represent in an imaginative way, you're being too fantastical, or you're not telling the Chinese myth in its original or something like that. When those in the audience who know something of the debate, the great literary debate between Frank Chin and Maxine Kingston, we know that it's part of an issue about cultural authenticity, right? And so yeah, I think it's a difficult, it's very hard to reference culture without re-commodifying it, without re-fetishizing it. So I think Yuen's work is very thoughtful about those kind of complications.
Thank you for answering
Thank you, Anne.
And thank you for having it as part of that MAP curriculum in your course.
I will share with the two of you if I get good answers.
Love it. I mean, what an honor to be.
I would love to see it. Thank you.
We do have a couple of questions. One is from Don Noonan to Yuen. The question is, I would like to ask about your artistic process, possibly through highlighting a favorite work. Your body of work is so deeply spiritual and personal. I wonder how you process all of those feelings in order to settle on your process. Thank you.
Oh, well, each one is different, as I said before, but let's talk about intentions, for instance, and that is the use of tea. But every single ball that I spent time with and wrapped and tied was done with a great deal of meditation. So I will say that was part of the process in that case of intentions. In the drawing of the Accumulation of Dreams, it was really important for me to lay out each individual leaf or drop or tear, what you would like to see, how you would like to interpret it. But for me, it was a person. It was one individual. And so I needed to really honor that. I've done this other project in a show in the ICA at Maine, in which I listed for a large map of migration, every single individual. So I would number it. And, I never got to the end because there was, over 60 million. So, but still, it was the practice of numbering, of remembering, of recalling was really, is part of what I do.
Yeah, your process is meticulous. I mean, as we all have seen with the map, with walking to Taipei, that just the process of those 10, 11 years is absolutely mind-blowing. We have a question from Nan Tull. says your work seems focused on women and their issues. For example, in the Immigration Bundles project, Leavings Belongings, which is I think what she's referencing and which we see behind you, it was women who made the bundles. Is this intentional, or was it women who were the most important to you in your early life?
Well, certainly women have been a really important model for me to keep strong. But in the case of Leavings Belongings, this is a joint project with another artist named Harriet Bart. And when we conceived of this project, we thought about women refugees. And it was in 2016, during the time when it was unavoidable to every time you opened up the newspaper. I mean, that was the headline of the mass migration that was happening. So it developed first from women. And as I kept on working through other projects, you know, I really felt that, for instance, at the Powell Art Center, I opened it up to anyone that wanted to come. And there, of course, maybe with self-selection, mostly women did come. And it was a wonderful time of just sharing stories with each other. It was intergenerational. It was, you know, inter-ethnicities. And it was just pretty an amazing process of being with women and hearing women's stories.
But I think, you know, from hearing you speak about this show for this many weeks and months and years, actually, just hearing about, you know, your grandmother, for example, as that guiding figure in your life for so long, that obviously leads and means a lot in terms of how you interpret and how you honor the people in your life. Well, we have a few more minutes, but, you know, I just do want to really acknowledge the incredible work that both of you have put out into the world, into scholarship in your case, Anne, and into our visual culture in your case, Yu-Wen, because I just don't think we have seen enough of it or heard enough of it or read enough of it. Anne and I were talking before this program started about her op-ed that was in the New York Times during, you know, as the anti-Asian, I don't even know how to say it, the hate that was happening. And you were telling me about, you know, your deadline was one day or less that for you to create the work, and you normally wouldn't have done that, you know, or submitted to such a crazy deadline, but you felt that it was urgent and that you had to do it, because how often do you ever hear these stories or from these voices in a place like the New York Times? Can the two of you just talk about that really briefly and how you feel now that, you know, this type of writing of yours, Anne, is out in the world, and it has been for a long time, but I love seeing it in the Atlantic. I love seeing it in the New York Times, you know, and Iwon, public art projects that you have going forward. We're going to see you again in San Francisco with Lantern Stories. You were voted, or you're not awarded Best Artist of Boston and Boston Magazine, you know, all of these accolades. How do you feel about that now? Is it amazing, or is it bittersweet? Is it like, finally, where are you in here?
Well, in that current New York Times article that asked how it feels to be Asian in today's America, I thought about the many, many responses to that. And for myself, I really thought that it was great. This whole ability now for me to really, it's so important to really be able to be more visible in talking about the situations and that I have not been able to talk about in the past. Yeah, I definitely feel that as a newly arrived immigrant, you know, you've always had to be quiet, you've had to assimilate, and being an Asian female just adds to another whole layer of silencing and erasure. But I feel at this point, there is this urgency to have this discussion. And this urgency and ability through my medium, which is art, and through Anne, which is, you know, amazing writing, that we have the opportunity to talk about this. And we should, and I feel like I want to.
Now, I have to say, I'll answer your question a little bit by going back to your other question, which is, when you say, why I agreed to this conversation, I mean, the other reason was I was so impressed by Praise Shadows Art Gallery. So I thought this is such an amazing, wonderful project. What a great space. The work he does in supporting, Asian American artists. I just thought this is, incredible. But yes, I do think that this is, most academics don't aspire to be public intellectuals. Some do, but most don't, and mostly because we're such introverts. But this is the moment I felt like I have to stop preaching to the choir. Here we are. By we, I mean people who have, worked for years on issues of social justice and racial equality. We're writing about really important things to the world that we're living through now, the traumatic versions that we're living through now. And it's important that people hear this too, like the general public, not just your students, And I thought a lot about how is it that Asian Americans have had such a long history in America, long history of being discriminated against, but also a long history of contribution. And yet so few people, even Asian Americans, know about this history. One answer, it's not that they're not important, it's that it's simply not taught in school. So one of the things that I, along with other people in my local area, have been doing is we've been, what's the word, lobbying or trying to get the New Jersey School Board to integrate Asian American history into the teaching of American history in age appropriate ways, of course, in the K through 12.
Excellent.
Yeah, I'll just tell you this really quick story. Years ago, I had an Asian American, a Japanese American student. She's third generation American, completely assimilated, of course. Basically American, a wonderful A+ student. She was training to be an opera singer. This is someone who is completely, she's at Princeton, she's completely at ease in the world. And she came to me after one of my Asian American studies courses and said, before this class, I didn't realize I owned a part of American history.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I just thought, oh my God, how it's so important that we, Asian American history and culture, part of public, just knowledge, information. So I do think it's very important to make these kind of public interventions because the silencing of that is what led us to this point of terrible xenophobia of Asian Americans.
Thank you. Yes, absolutely agree. And again, I appreciate you both so much for your work and your teaching and people coming through Yu-Wen's show has been a pleasure to see. I think Cynthia Yi's 90-year-old sister came by and she was ripped apart from her family in China, and that's a story in itself. There's a photo of her looking at the mala beads installation, intentions, and it makes you want to cry because you just see her entire story in front of her as she's facing your work. And Anne, thanks for teaching all of this and moving it forward. And as for the gallery, I appreciate all of the compliments. I'm just doing what I feel really, really lucky to do and working with artists that I adore and I think are important. What's cool is our next two shows are also by Asian American artists, and they couldn't be more different from the rest of one another. James Clark is a light artist. He's opening next month. And we have another Taiwanese American artist, but different generation, grew up in the Midwest, painter. It's so diverse, this diaspora. And I think that is also something that I want to communicate to the world because we are not all alike. We are so extremely different, but with common goals, right? And just trying to move it forward for my young children, for your children, for other students. But thank you both. Thank you to everybody for joining tonight. And yes, this is recorded for some of those who've asked. So we'll share that with all of you who